Good morning, and welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Michelle Struck. I am the Khosravi Chair in Principled Internationalism, the Director of the Humanitarian Agenda, and the Director of our Human Rights Initiative. Today, we bring to you a program, a subject that is something that is on many people's minds: global conflicts to watch in 2025, escalating humanitarian needs. 2024, this past year, was a deadly year for conflicts. At least 233,000 people were estimated to be killed in conflicts in 2024. That is data from ACLID, the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data, which was just released yesterday. Deaths due to conflict have doubled over the past 5 years amidst wars in Ukraine, Gaza, Myanmar, Syria, and elsewhere. This number has grown by 30% just since last year. And late last month, 2024 also reached a grim milestone for humanitarians. It was the deadliest year on record for aid workers, with 281 aid workers killed as of November 22nd, and unfortunately, a likelihood of more being killed as it surpassed last year's record. There's been incredible devastation and rising humanitarian needs. And today, sadly, as we near the very end of 2024's Global Humanitarian Appeal, which gives coordinates all of the humanitarian funding for conflicts and crises around the world, stands at only 43% funded, leaving vulnerable populations and people affected by conflicts out of the ability to receive basic assistance. It is my pleasure today, even with these grim milestones and these escalating humanitarian needs, to present a distinguished panel to discuss which conflicts people are watching in 2025, issues of refugee issues and displacement, health and humanitarian needs, and what can be done about it. So I will introduce our distinguished panel, and after that we will have a discussion, and we thank you for joining us online for this event today. Today I have joining us in the room Jochen Rieg, I have Juan Chavez Gonzalez, and online Zahir Sahlul and Jonathan Majok. I'll tell you a little bit about these distinguished speakers, and then we will get right into the conversation. Jonathan Majok is the Director of the Refugee and Forced Displacement Initiative at the Wilson Center here in Washington, D.C., and he provides thought leadership, strategic direction, and program vision. Before he joined the Wilson Center back in 2013, he worked at the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, and he's had a distinguished career managing study abroad programs and continuing to support USAID diaspora skills transfer programs for Southern Sudan. He also has worked as for an Arizona congressman at the U.S. House of Representatives and has an incredible amount of expertise on refugee issues. Jochen Rieg is the global lead for hard-to-reach and humanitarian access at the Norwegian Refugee Council, or NRC, and he leads and manages NRC's global access portfolio. And prior to joining NRC, Mr. Rieg worked with the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs since 2014, both in the field and at headquarters level, and has had field experiences in some very challenging places, including Yemen, Nigeria, South Sudan, Mozambique, and Iraq during the Mosul response. He's a technical expert on humanitarian access, and we're delighted to have him here today. And he's also worked with different NGOs in a variety of countries: South Sudan, Nepal, Myanmar, and Germany, focusing on issues like protection and human rights. Juan Chavez Gonzalez, who's a program advisor for humanitarian financing strategy and analysis at UN OCHA, based in New York. He's worked for 20 years in conflict prevention and recovery, peace building, development, and humanitarian action. He's the lead for disaster risk financing and international financial institution engagement at UN OCHA. And his work focuses on using prearranged financing, forecasts, and triggers to deploy anticipatory action. So we'll definitely get a little bit into that today. He's also led research at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and also the Zolberg Institute on Migration and Mobility at the New School. Then I have Dr. Zahir Sahlul, who's the president of Med Global. He is a physician known for his dedication to providing medical care and humanitarian aid to those in need. As the president of Med Global, a nonprofit organization that's committed to delivering crucial healthcare to populations affected by crisis and poverty worldwide. He's also the former president of the Syrian American Medical Society, which is how we met, and has led numerous medical missions personally to regions hit by natural disasters, including Syria, Ukraine, Colombia, Puerto Rico, Gaza, Yemen, and Bangladesh. He has a distinguished background, which I won't read all of, but professionally he is a critical care specialist at Advocate Christ Medical Center and St. Anthony's Hospital, and is associate professor in clinical medicine at the University of Illinois in Chicago. Of course, I could spend 10 minutes on each of our distinguished panelists' backgrounds, but instead I will get into this important discussion today. So I will start with a question for Juan. This morning, last week, I know that you and OCHA released your 2025 Global Humanitarian Overview. And as I mentioned, 2024's was unfortunately underfunded. I know that OCHA employed a new methodology for prioritizing humanitarian needs very rigorously, with an appeal for $47 billion to support 190 million people worldwide. So, given these incredible proliferation of needs and crises, could you tell us a little bit about the choices OCHA made to rigorously prioritize this humanitarian action? It would be wonderful to hear a little bit about the data released. So what does humanitarian need look like right now? And particularly, what do you see as driving those trends in need, especially as it relates to conflicts?
Well, thanks so much, Michelle, and great to be here with everybody. So indeed, last week, OCHA launched the Global Humanitarian Overview. This is something that we do yearly to give us a roadmap of what kind of collective action is necessary to bring help to the people that need it the most. And it's never easy work, but it is increasingly getting more difficult, not only because of the financing constraints and the challenges associated with ensuring that we mobilize enough resources as a system, but also because we're seeing the nature of problems is changing as well. So conflicts in places where colleagues are probably going to go deeper into, like in Sudan, Ukraine, Gaza, are incredibly deadly. You alluded to this also in your introductory remarks. And the needs are extremely complex, and the human condition is really on the edge of a precipice in many of these places. So delivering assistance in these highly volatile, insecure environments is not just an issue of whether we have enough resources. It's also operationally very, very complex. So that's one thing that I would say. The other thing that I would say is that this is all compounded as well by an increased frequency and severity of natural disasters. So we're seeing drought events happening more frequently, flooding happening more frequently, and the impact of hurricanes, including near the shores of the U.S., also being quite devastating. So a lot of this is also becoming harder to predict because many of these shocks change trajectory and pick up speed, especially hurricanes, very quickly. So within 24 hours, something that you thought was going to be a Category 3 storm suddenly becomes a Cat 4 or Cat 5. So that's also a challenge. Now, in the middle of all of this, we're also seeing that there are specific populations that are extremely vulnerable. So we're seeing that about 400 million children worldwide live in conflict zones or are trying to leave conflict zones. That's quite a daunting number. It's higher than the population of the US. So think about that. And also we're seeing that children and women and the elderly and people with disability oftentimes have needs that are not necessarily met in the same way than other groups. So healthcare needs are quite specific, and I know that colleagues will speak about that. There's also gender-based violence. So there's a range of other threats, even within these contexts, that are not necessarily the result of a specific shock, but just the fact that crises become protracted and it becomes extremely hard for civilians and for specific groups to survive. So I would basically say that as an overview. And you mentioned 305 million people is the number in the Global Humanitarian Overview of people that need assistance, but we're not going to be able to reach all of them. You also mentioned that this year we were able to mobilize around 40% of the global ask. And so, yes, of course, that's part of the reason why we're not able to reach everybody, but also because we want to be very focused about where people are most severely affected by some of these problems and prioritize them. So that's really the core of the methodology, understanding who needs the help most desperately and most urgently, and trying to ensure that we are going to the hardest to reach places, that we are going to the populations that are most in need. And I think that in all of this, I'm hoping that we get a chance in the discussion to talk about some of the approaches that we're taking that can give us a glimmer of hope in the middle of this landscape to do our job better and to be more proactive. But one thing that I would say is humanitarian action, as we all know, is short-term by nature. So we do this every year, and we try to be very, very quick in delivering life-saving assistance and protection. And so that's why we also have to be quite pointed. And the effort of country teams across the world has been to identify who needs help the most and what are the most essential things that are needed to save those lives and prioritize that. And in addition to that, we need to get a little bit creative also to gain some efficiencies. So we know that cash assistance in some places is an extremely efficient way of delivering assistance. It also empowers people to make choices and meet problems on their own terms. So that's one thing that we're trying to do more of. And we're also trying to not only address the suffering we see, but also the suffering we foresee. So for the things that are predictable, and there's many things that are predictable, we're not taking the approach that crises are surprises. Some of these can be anticipated, and where that is the case, we're trying to initiate the response earlier. And by doing this, we can save hundreds of millions of dollars. This leads to a cheaper response, a faster response, and a much more dignified response. So I'm going to stop there for now, but thanks again very much for having me.
Thank you, and thank you for painting that both, I think, tragic and also hopeful picture of the fact that this 305 million people, what you've assessed in coordination with a number of partners around the world to be the most vulnerable populations, and yet there's a tragic triage where they still, we expect, may not be funding. This is in the context of budget cuts and anticipated or worried budget cuts in Germany, with 50% of their humanitarian budget being cut, concerns about the US, and I appreciate your comments on it's not just the funding, it's also the operations, because war simply, especially you talk about conflict zones, is being waged differently. With over the past 5 years, people reporting a several 100% increase in the use of bombing. So the way war is waged is also affecting this. And thank you for providing hope to talk about the fact that OCHA is spearheading and other partners approaches of anticipation and prevention, or anticipating and pre-positioning aid so that this valuable humanitarian funding can be saved. So I think these are really important points. I'd love to get more into some of those solutions, but I'll turn to one more question for you before moving on. Just given this prioritization and the boundary setting that you talked about in humanitarian response, many people are worried that there are communities that could be left behind, and in particular, those who are in these protracted conflict situations are on my mind. A lot of them have chronic health needs. They have needs that maybe don't rise to the level of the severity of those that are newly displaced or those that are newly part of conflict. In your view, whose role it is to raise the gaps that are posed by this ruthless, I'm using my own word, ruthless, but ruthless prioritization, and how can sectors work together to ensure complementarity so that those people are not left behind?
Okay. Now, look, I want to say 2 or 3 things here. Number one, we advocate for absolutely every single person on earth who needs assistance. And that is free of cost. We don't need to stop advocating for certain groups to be able to advocate for others, right? So that's not a choice, a moral choice that we're making. We're advocating for every single one of those 305 millions of lives that need assistance. Number two, I think in terms of roles, the multilateral international aid system is very, very complex. But we know that we have been able to make a lot of progress when we have focused more on problems than on mandates. It's about the ability to work collectively. So yes, we will have to make some choices to focus first on the ones that are most severely affected. But we also will need to advocate and work better with partners such as international financial institutions, so that in places that are extremely fragile, they can increase their commitments to stay and deliver basic services for those populations. So this is perhaps one of the things where you will see the humanitarian system becoming much more intentional in not creating silos, but in promoting collective action. So I want to be very clear. The boundary setting exercise is not an exercise about creating a fence and telling the world we're only going to focus on this group and we're going to ignore the group that is beyond the fence. That's not the case at all. It's about how can we humanitarians deliver the most effective work we can do in the most extreme circumstances and contexts, while also ensuring that we are promoting collective action, that we are bringing in development actors to crisis settings. Crises are not the exclusive domain of humanitarian actors. And very rarely I have seen humanitarian crisis having a humanitarian solution. You need development solutions, right? So this is partly the rationale or the spirit behind the ruthless prioritization, as you called it. So I would say that we're going to be definitely much more intentional in collective action that transcends divides in mandate and that focuses on problems. But we need to be very clear about what we can do and what we can deliver.
I completely understand that, and thank you for highlighting it, because I think it's an important message for policymakers that are thinking about what kinds of funding, what kinds of policy solutions and prioritization that they should give, and how they view the roles of different actors, and they encourage that coordination. So I really appreciate those comments. I want to move to one of the drivers of conflicts and talk to John Thon Majok. As of June 2024, there are 122.5 million people that were forcibly displaced globally due to conflict. And conflict, violence, disaster, and other reasons. And we know this number has been on the rise for quite some time and is estimated to rise in 2025. And we also know that the number of people remaining refugees for 5 years or longer has also more than doubled over the past decade. So people are refugees for longer periods of time. So what are the major trends that you are looking at related to displacement and conflict? And it would be so meaningful to hear, how does this experience of refugees and displaced people vary across the different conflicts that you are paying attention to today?
Thank you, Michelle. As you mentioned at the beginning, the world is increasingly bleeding and on fire everywhere. But the spirit of the displaced people gives us hope amid uncertainty. So let me start with these opening remarks. Forced displacement is a defining issue of the 21st century. It is a growing global humanitarian issue that requires sustained leadership, international cooperation, collective efforts, and the action to address it. The plight of more than 120 million refugees, internally displaced persons, and asylum seekers is just a manifestation of bigger problems whose root causes are deep and widespread. And so in a conversation like this, it is important to talk about how to address both the root causes and the symptoms of forced migration. With the world at a crossroads, we are presented with both challenge and opportunity. On the one hand, the current trends paint a bleak future for humanity, host countries, and especially the displaced people, including more than 47 million uprooted children whose future is being put on hold. On the other hand, it is an opportunity for the US and others to lead by example to address the pressing issues we face. In the absence of global leadership, instability and insecurity and other factors that drive people away from their home continue to breed those conditions that cause people to flee. So what is in it for us? In its latest Global Peace Index report, the Institute for Economics and Peace finds that the monetary impact of violence on the global economy was $19.1 trillion. That was in 2023. That is an equivalent of 13.5% of the world GDP, or 2,300 per person per year. So we are at a time when instability in one place affects everyone everywhere, and that's why we should care. But my reason for optimism comes from the refugees and the displaced people themselves. Their resilience and talent should continue to inspire the public, practitioners, policymakers to innovate for solutions amid challenges and uncertainty. They are a source of inspiration. We should celebrate their talents, nurture them, and promote their skill. And so policies that recognize this will have positive impact. Now, coming to the trend, answer the question, the trend that are here now, one of them is that forced displacement is increasingly protracted. And so we have about 65% of the global refugees having lived in the host country for 5 years or more, and that is the protracted situation. In 2023, there were more than 25 million children, refugees living in 58 protracted situations across 37 countries. So that is a major trend that is not humanitarian in nature anymore. It is increasingly developmental. Second, conflict and the causes of conflict are also becoming more complex. We have seen everywhere in the top countries that are, Sudan, there are multiple players in there. We've seen in Syria, in Ukraine, and elsewhere. And then the third trend, more refugees are located now in urban areas than the traditional refugee camps. And that again become more of development challenges because people are living in cities. And that is a policy focus that should switch from the traditional way where we view refugees as a temporary phenomenon living in the camp, for example, and they will return home tomorrow. That is not the issue now. And so these are some of the things, but all in all, 3 factors remain constant amid all of this. That one is refugees are located in countries that are neighboring the countries of origin, and that is about 69%. Second, we have the protracted nature of the displacement, and third, refugees are hosted by low to middle income countries, and that has implication for the resources we provide to them, but also for how the domestic audience react to this. And so this is a complexity of the environment we are in, but as I mentioned, there is always a silver lining, and I will talk more later on, but I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I definitely want to come back to some of the things you said and the implications for some of the specific conflicts that I know we're looking at in 2025, including Syria, including Sudan. I'll go first, though, to Jochen to ask about another one of these elements of what we've seen about conflict, especially in 2024, something that's driving humanitarian needs, something that is challenging all humanitarians as they negotiate how they're able to actually reach populations that are in need. So we know that there is an alarming trend of governments, particularly, but other issues, causing delay or denial of aid being allowed within the borders of territories. We've seen humanitarian norms, the degradation of those international humanitarian legal norms that are supposed to allow aid in. So to hear from you, I know you're an expert on this, what are the trends that you see about reaching people in hard-to-reach places, especially in conflicts? And are there particular conflicts in which you are tracking this that everyone should be paying attention to access in 2025?
Thanks, Michelle. Thank you so much, and thanks to colleagues as well. So I think if we look at the main challenges, and some of them have already been mentioned, but it's certainly like a worrying trend over the last 2 to 3 years is like the selective application and disregard of international humanitarian law. You mentioned the number of aid workers killed, 281 in 2024. So far, the year is not over yet. 280 the year before, which is double the number of any year we had before since the tracking has been done. And so one of the key trends, I think, for us to watch out for is like the knock-on effects of the disregard of international humanitarian law. And so in conflict settings, so first and foremost, and I think that's a key piece here, is that most of the humanitarian operations are actually being held up, impeded, or denied through like bureaucratic processes rather than conflict. And so the concern is like increased violence against humanitarian workers in their efforts to reach people in need. And as Juan said, especially in harder to reach areas, we need to prioritize, at least to a certain extent, be more focused and ensure that we reach underserved population in their need, and more not than often they are in hard to reach areas. So like our capability and capacity to do so is crucial. But in order for us to be able to do that, we need support. And the support is, first of all, financial. We've been talking about the budget cuts, but also the support is supporting international norms and legal frameworks. There are obligations of the parties to a conflict in order for us to facilitate that access. So it's more on the parties than on us, and I think that's something we need to have a conversation about. And that brings me to the next point, counterterrorism measures and sanctions. The conversation is ongoing in Syria right now. A lot has been done. Security Council resolutions, carve-outs and so forth, which I think is a very positive step. Nevertheless, it still impedes timely and principled humanitarian action, especially when we talk about emergency settings. Then the changes to the geopolitical dynamics and the rise of non-traditional actors, I think, is one key piece we're looking at, and we see these developments, especially in the Sahel, but we also see it in Afghanistan, we see it in Yemen, where our usual engagement to influence actors, to leverage, are not working any longer. Humanitarians are mostly the only international actor on the ground. So humanitarians are often being used for political purposes. And that goes back as well to one point which was made, and I would go even further. I have not seen actually a humanitarian setting where a humanitarian solution was found, but it needs to be a political solution. And so they're here as well. I think we need support on the political side to address the key issues and root causes of conflict in order to move forward. A divided UN Security Council, of course, as part of the changes to the geopolitical dynamics. And and then the climate shocks, which comes in addition to the challenges we face. So in NRC, we run this annual hard to reach assessment, whereby we look at what are the key impediments, blocking, delaying our ability to respond to people in need in hard to reach areas. And while conflict is certainly the most severe impact on aid workers as well as on the people we're here to serve, but I think what is interesting is that bureaucratic and administrative impediments for the second year in a row now is the most frequent impediment, and it's a very costly. It's very costly to manage bureaucratic processes. So it's your visa restrictions, it's your MOUs you need to sign with the ministries, it's your movement restrictions you have in country settings, which delay humanitarian aid. And then lastly is like logistic and climate related issues, whereby in the past we were able to mitigate some of these with additional financial resources and planning. That will become more difficult moving forward with the budget cuts, but also with the increase in climate-related events. And so I think a couple of, and so especially West Africa, East Africa, where we see conflict, bureaucratic related impediments, as well as climate-related events compound the issues in these regions, where we have then a much harder time to reach the people in need. And so maybe just lastly, we talk about these numbers and like the severity of the needs, and often, again, like, and I think I made that point earlier on, but like it's really important to emphasize that the onus on the protection of aid workers and the responsibility to reach these people in needs is with the parties to the conflict first and foremost. And there needs to be concerted efforts by the international community to support humanitarian actors, but also like put up the pressure and keep the pressure up in order for us to be able to do that and support existing legal and normative frameworks. I'll leave it at that for now. Happy to speak more later.
Thank you so much. And this kind of language of bureaucratic impediments is always so frustrating to think about and hear about. It's like a slow death of the work by paperwork, not of people, but by paperwork. And that is something that is incredibly difficult to watch in countries like Sudan, where we've seen that happen over and over again, and the others that you mentioned. So I want to turn last now, just for opening to Dr. Zahlul. I think that, we've all, I know I certainly have, but we've all been watching the recent developments in Syria. After nearly 14 years of war, the events in Syria have moved very quickly, and it highlights a humanitarian crisis that finds Syrians in a state of their greatest need since the conflict began. So could you tell us from your experience, how do you see the humanitarian situation today, and what do you expect to see in 2025 in terms of humanitarian needs and what can be done about them? Oh, and I think you're on mute. I'm so sorry if you could unmute it.
This is a big question, Michelle, and thank you for focusing on Syria. This is actually in the last week or so. There's a lot of good news coming back from Syria. I'm seeing droves of refugees coming back from Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan. Today, there were jubilant crowds in major cities celebrating an end of a dark chapter that was signified by human rights violations, by torture, industrial tortures. I'm going to give one number. About 150,000 people in Syria were forcefully disappeared and unaccounted for. Most of them died under torture. So 1 out of 100 Syrians died under torture in the regime's prisons. So the first videos we've seen after the fall of the Assad regime is videos of liberated prisoners coming out and in very poor conditions, men, women, children even, who are traumatized, and many prisoners who are unaccounted for, and now we're discovering these mass graves. But the good news that we have refugees coming back. And I hope that these good news continues to come. Syria is one of those conflicts that epitomize the conflicts that our colleagues were talking about. The root causes are mixed between poor governance, climate change, geopolitics. At one point, there were more than 13 countries and entities interfering or fighting inside Syria. That created circumstances where you had fragmentation of Syria before this recent changes, 4 different Syrias and 4 different administrations with problems related to access to each one of them. Displacement of the population, half of the population in Syria have been displaced over the past 14 years, 7 million refugees, not only to low and middle income countries, which took most of the refugees, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, Egypt, and of course Turkey, which took about 3.5 million refugees, but also high-income countries that took a lot of refugees. Germany has 1 million Syrian refugees, other European countries also. Our country here, the US, took about 30,000 refugees, a small amount, the number. But also the other issues related to the access issues that we're talking about. At one point, 2.5 million Syrians were under siege. We've seen the impact of that on children with malnutrition in Madaya and Zabadani, where children died because of the siege by their own government. And also attacks on hospitals and norms. More than 650 hospitals were bombed by the Assad regime and by Russia. More than 950 doctors and nurses were killed. One of them is one of my colleagues, Dr. Abdelkarim Al-A'raj, who is a cardiologist from a small village in north of Hama called Kafar Zeta. His hospital was bombed, so he wanted to rebuild the hospital. The villagers told him, please, please, please don't build it in that village because we will be bombed. And he built it in the middle of a mountain, in a cave. I visited that cave in 2016 and spoke with Dr. Abdelkarim Al-A'raj, and it was amazing. You have these monitors and ventilators in the middle of this cave in a hospital. It's called the Central Cave Hospital in Syria, and he was providing care to the communities there. Unfortunately, 2 months after I visited him, he was attacked while he was leaving the hospital, and he was killed. And he's one of the 950 doctors and nurses and many other humanitarians who were killed in Syria. And this erosion of norms of medical neutrality, of impartiality, is something that we're seeing again and again in Ukraine and of course in Gaza. And it's affecting how we deliver care. It doesn't look like there's norms anymore in some of these areas, and there's no accountability. Warring parties are killing and attacking hospitals and killing humanitarians without any accountability, and this is a problem. And that will cause more harm to the humanitarian aid and to the civilian populations if it continues. We've seen chemical weapons attacks in Syria, more than 300 of them, but at the same time, we've seen the resilience of the population. I worked in hospitals in Syria that were built underground because the local communities wanted to provide healthcare to their population in caves. The people, despite of the displacement, continued to thrive and build hospitals and build clinics. And with minimal supports from the international community and advocacy, they were able to thrive and continue to stabilize. Idlib, northwest Syria, which was at one point the stage, still half of the population in that area are internally displaced from other parts of Syria, had better healthcare systems and response to the COVID pandemic when COVID hit than the rest of Syria that was under the control of government. So there's always things that are shining, of examples of local communities that are, despite of the challenges, they respond significantly. In Gaza, the same thing. When I was in Gaza in January, I asked children in Gaza, what would you like to be in the future? And every child said, I want to be a doctor. So these communities, despite of the huge challenges and attacks on them and so forth, they continue to thrive, they continue to build, and they deserve our support and assistance.
Thank you so much for that, and thank you for bringing in those experiences. And some of these really devastating trends for humanitarian workers, for health workers, for hospitals, the erosion of norms. I think it would be really helpful as well to now go into the conversation to talk about what are the conflicts that we are most concerned about going forward in 2025. With so many in the world, with the kinds of escalations we're seeing, it's difficult to get through all of them in this program. But I know that you've mentioned a couple, Dr. Sahel, you mentioned Gaza, you've mentioned Ukraine. Perhaps you don't mind starting, if you could tell us what are some that you are personally most concerned about. And I will add one fact, which is just, I cited ACLED earlier, and they predicted yesterday a 20% increase in conflict next year. And some of the ones they named were Colombia and Mexico, and some areas of Africa like the Sahel and Great Lakes region. Of course, Middle East was another one that they were concerned about. But if you could talk about your concerns, it would be really helpful.
The mission of MedGlobal is to provide access to healthcare in disaster areas, whether it's natural disasters or man-made. So we have teams on the ground that clinics, hospitals run by local doctors and nurses in 10 different countries, including Sudan and Lebanon and Syria and Gaza and Ukraine and Colombia, Mexico, and Bangladesh and Yemen. So each one of these countries, of course, is something that we need to worry about. But in particular nowadays, Sudan, and I'm sure that our colleagues will be talking about it more extensively because of the impact of the crisis on large number of population. More than 8 million are displaced and 14 million are in need for assistance, and the poor access to many areas in Sudan, and the fragmentation and the geopolitics, and of course the famine in Darfur. And the fact that we're not paying enough attention to it. But Gaza, of course, is a major example. When I was in Gaza, I've been in Gaza 4 times in the last 4 years, but this last time was a horrible experience where I've seen the impact of attacks on hospitals, on bombing of civilian infrastructures, the mass casualties. Many of them are children, and the struggle of the doctors in Gaza and humanitarians to provide assistance to the population. It's still a war in Gaza. Unfortunately, my organization lost 2 humanitarians. One of them is a physician in Kamal Adwan Hospital. He was killed while he was coming to the hospital. Another lab worker also was killed when he was leaving the hospital. So, and we have 6 of our staff who are detained. And right now Gaza is not in the news, and that's another problem, that when crisis become chronic, then people don't pay enough attention. But I'm really worried about what will happen after the end of the war in Gaza. What would be the governance structure? There's a lot of talk, but it doesn't look like anyone has an idea about what will govern Gaza, what entity, about the rebuilding process. I mean, we talk a lot about crises, but each one of these crises require a lot of money to rebuild. Gaza may require $150 billion in some of estimates, or even more. The same thing with Syria, more than $200 billion, the estimates. Same thing in Ukraine. And there's not enough money in the international system. The Syrian humanitarian response plan is only 30% funded. There's a need for $4 billion, only 1.2 are put by the funding entities. So Gaza definitely is a major, and Sudan and Ukraine. We're seeing more and more attacks on civilian infrastructures, on hospitals. According to the WHO, more than 1,200 healthcare centers were attacked by the Russians. And also we're seeing recently a trend of attacking on energy sources. So many of the cities in Ukraine don't have electricity, and the winter, of course, is harsh in Ukraine. So I think we need to pay more attention, not only about what are happening in the crises, but how can we make sure that the international humanitarian system and the norms and international humanitarian laws are enforced, and that there will be accountability to the erosion, as you've mentioned, of these norms, and also the impact of these crises on the rest of the world. Sometimes we think that these crises are contained, but they affect not only the region, but the whole world. And we've seen the impact of the Syrian crisis and the refugee crisis in Europe, and that how did that lead to the rise of populism and anti-refugee sentiment, and also in the United States. And we're seeing the same pattern because of the migrant crisis in Southern America on the politics of the United States.
Thank you for that. And I would love to turn to John Thon to talk about that too. I think it's, in my view, such an underappreciated point of how dramatically the Syrian refugee crisis affected, like you said, politics in Europe, the way that refugees and migration and displacement generally are always described as a problem, rather than thinking about people's inherent rights to be able to seek a better life, which I know here in the United States, many people, our families came here because they were seeking a better life. So it's not a new issue, and yet it's characterized as such a problem. In fact, looking at Syria, more than 14, I think the number I saw was 14 European countries already said they will pause asylum claims for Syrians days after the government, after the regime fell. So John Thon, it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on crises you're watching, and then also just how these issues are impacting, the crises of displacement are impacting more broadly.
Sure, and my colleague just mentioned some of them, but I want to start with Sudan. Right now, Sudan had the largest internal displacement in the world. The number has exceeded 11 million internal displaced people, and the conflict is worsening. I think for context, since independence in 1956, Sudan has seen at least 18 coups. And so the country has been in war with itself for decades. And then in 2011, we've seen how the country disintegrated into two with the independence of South Sudan. And so I was a victim of the 21 civil war that was between the North and the South, and became a refugee in the 1980s, lived in neighboring countries before I was resettled here. So the dynamic of the conflict in Sudan is not a surprise that it's just burst into this. But for those who don't know the context, I think the lack of understanding is why there's no much attention to the country. Humanitarian organizations, including human rights, describe the situation of the people of Sudan are facing an impossible situation caught between conflict, famine, crime, disasters, and disease. So the refugees, the more than almost 3 million refugees going to neighboring countries, Chad has at least 500,000 in its camps. And that crisis of war itself is being exacerbated by, climate disasters. Extensive flooding recently in Chad has exacerbated the situation of refugees there. The prospects for peace are not there yet, because these two arms of the military and militia turned to military are destroying the country. And because there's no attention globally to them, they are not willing to come to the table yet to end this war that is causing damage to the people. So I think on my top of the list is that Sudan. It should be on the attention because of its largest internal displacement, but because also of geopolitical importance to U.S. and other countries. And then Syria, of course. That was the moment that I could relate to what happened last week when South Sudan became independent, or after this comprehensive peace agreement. There was this spontaneous joy, and people were already want to return home. And that's what happened when the Syrian leader was toppled. The refugees were full with joy, and as mentioned, others are returning. But the UNHCR, the UN agency, is warning us to wait and see, because it's not that simple just for a person that has been away for decades to go home tomorrow. And countries that have frozen the asylum application for Syrians, again, should be cautioned in terms of their approach, because there are factors to consider for an organized, safe, and voluntary return. And that needs collective efforts from all of us. So I'm watching what the Syrian prospect for refugee return would be in 2025 and how the global community is going to help. Coming to Myanmar, the Rohingya refugees, it has been 7 years and almost 1 million are still there in the neighboring Bangladesh and others, but the situation is still ongoing, and it's losing its focus from the global community. So that is something to watch. You saw Venezuela in Latin America with the incoming U.S. administration and the prospect of a new Secretary of State. I think the focus, foreign policy to the Americas. I am watching how this will address the Venezuelan issue that has been going on, and of course Ukraine, Gaza, Afghanistan also. Those are going there. But I think the crisis, the conflict that are not receiving much attention are what we are bringing up through our initiative, so that policy and the symptom and both the causes are addressed, not just reacting to the displacement of people, but look at really what actually caused this situation. And I will be, in the end, talk about some of the approach that should be applied. But I think prevention and preparedness, it's something we need to take seriously here. So I will stop there.
That is such an excellent point to end on, and thank you for those points. I mean, we've heard over and over again from humanitarians, there are no humanitarian solutions to humanitarian problems, and yet humanitarians persevere. They persevere despite the danger they're in, prioritize in order and find out smarter approaches to being able to use evidence and pre-planning to be able to get aid to people in need. So I think what I want to end on for each of you is, what are the solutions that are in humanitarians' power that you are looking at, whether that's preparedness solutions or particular, especially in conflict-affected areas, some of the areas in your expertise that you see looking forward that people should be paying attention to. So I will start with Juan to see, I know OCHA has been thinking about this proactive approach, and if you could describe some of the ways that that in 2025 we should be looking toward these kinds of solutions and not lose hope despite this bleak picture that we've painted.
Absolutely, and I should say first that there's no single solution, and even though that I will be focusing on one approach that I really like, I know that it's not necessarily the approach that solves every single problem. So that, I think, needs to be declared from the outset. But taking a proactive mindset to crisis really pays off. So our office manages the largest contingency humanitarian fund for the United Nations. It's called the Central Emergency Response Fund, which is about $500 million, sometimes 600 million a year on average. The fund is going to turn 20 next year. So there's massive expectation about how we can take all the experience from the last 20 years and improve what we can do with the money we manage. And I think in the last 5 years, something that has been very exciting is for us to be able to pre-arrange some of the money that we have in the CERF, in the Central Emergency Response Fund, for the things that we can predict. So right now, there's a portfolio of anticipatory action frameworks that is worth about 100 million for a range of shocks in a range of places. We're dealing with flooding, we're dealing with storms and cyclones, we're dealing with cholera outbreaks in the DRC, for instance, drought, and the basic proposition is quite simple. Humanitarian action typically functions by observing needs, mobilizing money, coming up with a plan, and implementing the plan. We're flipping that model on its head. So we are pre-arranging the money in advance. We are pre-agreeing with UN agencies and our partners what needs to happen before the shock or before the impact of the shock becomes severe, and what kind of signals do we need to take action. So this is really about bringing together science, money, practice, and being proactive. Now, is this going to work everywhere? Probably not. Is it going to work for every shock? Probably not. But I think that if we combine this kind of approach with the knowledge that we have from almost 2 centuries of humanitarian action about how crises evolve, we can mitigate the impact of at least the problems that we can predict. And I think this is especially important in regions such as the Sahel, which have been described here by colleagues. This is incredibly important also in countries that are currently paying a lot of debt service, and where governments are having very, very narrow fiscal space to invest in social services. And we need to make sure that they don't become humanitarian clients, so to speak, right? So right now, nobody's focusing on a range of middle-income countries where there are a lot of pockets of fragility. We don't want to have to be dealing with a new wave of humanitarian crisis in the years ahead. So we have to be proactive, not simply to deal with the problems that we have now, but looking at how these proactive approaches are bridges to avoid that some of these countries fall into a state of crisis. So I think that there's a moral argument, there's an economic argument. I fully agree with comments colleagues made about how a problem anywhere is a problem everywhere when it comes to humanitarian crisis. These are really big problems, and I think your audience, if there's one takeaway that I would like them to take from this discussion, is that we're talking about huge problems that are hugely complex. So if we tackle one well, we're really solving a problem that has global impact. So yes, I think this is exciting. This also gives us an opportunity as humanitarians to work in a more interdisciplinary way, to work in a more cross-sectoral way, and to look at the human condition not simply as something that we care about when somebody is on the computer screen, on the phone, or on TV that we are seeing suffering, but ahead of suffering. So it's about understanding that the value of a life at risk in the future is just as much as the value of a life in need today. That's very, very difficult, very challenging to say, but if we can find practical solutions to that moral problem, that will go a long way. So we're doing this in more than 19 countries at the moment. This is not something that we do alone. We work collectively with the UN system and our NGO partners and civil society. We're also in many places finding strong partnerships with governments, disaster management agencies, meteorological agencies that are helping us agree on those signals, on those triggers that we will use to deploy health. I'll just end with one example. In Bangladesh, ahead of flooding, we were able to release funding within minutes of the signal going off. Minutes.
Wow.
And the families that we helped, we ran a lot of independent impact evaluations on all of these frameworks. The families that we helped were about 40% better off nutritionally than families that did not receive anticipatory assistance. They were in less debt, they were economically doing better thanks to cash transfers ahead of flooding. So these are really interesting approaches that we really need to scale up.
Thank you so much for highlighting that and highlighting the interconnectedness. Because even as we're talking about conflicts, it's not like conflicts happen and natural disasters happen and they don't ever cross borders. There's so many countries where both are happening. And many of those countries, like in East Africa, are also hosting enormous numbers of refugees at the same time. So all of these things are interconnected. And I want to thank you as well for raising that important approach, especially as everyone in DC is so focused on a new administration. What will they do? We've seen administrations in the past look at foreign aid when they come from a Republican perspective that think about transparency and accountability and reform. They think about making aid institutions be evidence-based. They think about exit strategies. These are the kinds of things that we're all discussing as what will happen in the new administration. And looking at this kind of approach as an example of how can you use and anticipate, use science-based, evidence-based approaches to be able to get aid to people so much faster. I think that is really great to highlight. I'll move to each of you for your last statements, and if you could think about that idea of a solution, especially that is within our control, that you want to leave as a key message for those that are listening today. So Jochen, over to you.
Thank you so much. I think like one key point for me is like back to basics, right? So we have like overcomplicated humanitarian response to bureaucracy in the system. And I think the one good thing which comes out of like the budget cuts, we're actually now forced to like prioritize is maybe the wrong word, but to ensure we're more efficient and effective with what we're doing. And I hope we're moving away from like this from coordinating bureaucratic processes to coordinating an operational response, right? Because I think that's where we need to go. And like and the other piece I want to mention, which I think is crucial, is that when I spoke about the access impediments, we're looking at globally, they're not targeted against NRC, against any other NGO, against OCHA, against any other UN agency. They're collectively targeted at the humanitarian community. So that requires collective action and an engagement and a response. And then last thing, very last thing, I'm honest, is the integration of humanitarian access into more of like the planning process. And that goes along, Juan, with what you said about anticipatory action. We're currently looking at humanitarian access as a reactive function to support an issue when it's already in full swing. We need to integrate humanitarian access into like the planning cycle to ensure we're prepared for what's to come, and we need to understand that we need to manage access issues while we often don't find solutions. The solutions are sitting on the political side of the aisle. We need to manage that, and we need that capacity and the anticipation of that ahead of time through the integration.
Thank you. Fully agree. And the collective action, such an important point. John Thon, would love to hear your final message for everyone, if there's a solution or something you'd like to highlight.
Thank you. When talking about being proactive and prepared, I would like to bring the issue of displacement impact assessment. This is a concept that is not new. There is environmental impact assessment. So government should do displacement impact assessment to assess the consequence of the policies before they come out with them, because those have consequence in terms of conflict that then eventually lead to people being displaced. So think of when you come with sanctions, do displacement impact assessment. That's one. Two, I want to also bring where I start off. All these challenges needs leadership. Leadership by example. And so I urge the most powerful countries to lead by example. And the US has done that in terms of being the global leader in humanitarian assistance. I think you can think of the vacuum. If US is not leading, who will fill the vacuum? And we talk about these numbers, but there are people behind these numbers. So leadership, effective leadership, leadership by example saves lives. And then finally, an encouraging global trend that we have seen has been the encouragement of having displaced people participate in global forum to come up with issues that affect them. And so that meaningful participation of refugees is very important because they can be part of the solution. We should not see them as passive victims. They are people that we can learn from their resilience, but also their contribution to the society. So they need to be part of this. And the current global humanitarian architecture is fragmented. We should think of this integration of the ADP, Humanitarian Development Peace Nexus. I think it's going back to the basic. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think your point on not seeing people affected by conflict as passive victims and seeing their contributions is such a great segue to Dr. Sahul, because it was certainly for me working with the Syrian American Medical Society when Dr. Sahul was president that I saw firsthand how ingenious so many of the people that are the diaspora communities, people displaced by conflict, refugees, were at coming up with their own solutions, taking problems into their own hands. I know that's what's driving the important push for localization that's happening in our sector. We haven't talked about that as a solution, but that is incredibly important. So I want to give the last word before I close to Dr. Sahul. If you could talk about what key message you want to leave us with, and if there's a solution that you want to highlight. Oh, and you're on mute. So sorry.
Thank you for giving me the last word. And I want to underscore what John has mentioned about trusting the local communities who are impacted by these disasters and crises. They bring a lot of creativity and they provide better solutions than we provide in the West. And I've seen that in Palestine, in Gaza, in Ukraine, in Yemen, and also in Syria, of course. But one of the issues that we have not talked about, and we're seeing it right now in the context of Syria, that after the fall of the Assad regime, we have refugees coming back. There is no more Captagon produced and exported to the region. You have no problem with access. And we're talking about now civic society role in Syria. So sometimes we tend to repeat the same thing, expecting different results. Providing humanitarian aid and not addressing the root causes of these crises, which are related to poor governance, sometimes climate change, and sometimes geopolitics. So I think maybe putting more emphasis on the root causes of these crises, and especially governance and corruption of government and failed states, may be the way to go. And also, when we started, Michelle, in the first report that we joined together, and I think you wrote a big chunk of it, which is the impact of the crisis in Syria on doctors risking lives to save lives, the ordeal of Syrian physicians when their hospitals are attacked and they are tortured because they are providing health care. We don't talk about accountability, and I think this is something that the international system, ICC, International Court of Justice, should be focusing on. We have not seen any person or entity or warring party tried because they bombed hospitals or killed physicians or humanitarians. And I think this is something that maybe we should focus more on in the next year.
Thank you so much. And it's quite personal hearing that, of course, hearing about your colleagues who were killed working, understanding that the UN, I know in Gaza alone, has lost, the last count I saw this morning was 333 people. It's quite upsetting, and definitely rightfully pointing to political and other institutions that should be handling these crises that humanitarians are responding to is worthwhile. So I just want to thank you all. This has been such an incredibly diverse discussion of some of the most challenging places that we're all focused on day in and day out, being inspired by the people affected by crisis, by our own colleagues that are working on this every day, and working to try to do at least a small part of alleviating the suffering we can alleviate. I wanted to thank USAID's Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance for their generous sponsorship of and allowing us to hold events and discussions like these. I want to thank my team members, Aminé and Jude, for their contributions to this event. I want to thank the CSIS broadcasting staff, of which there are so many. I have a long list, and that includes Tori, Theo, Arturo, Chi, Eric, Dwayne, Donish, Craig, and Alex. If you've ever wondered how much goes into these productions, now you know it's a long list of people that make it possible. And of course, I want to thank the distinguished panelists today for bringing life to this discussion. I hope everyone watching today continues to stay engaged with the CSIS humanitarian agenda and with each of the programs and organizations here. You've got great data from OCHA to dig into, NRC and following their work, Med Global, and of course the Wilson Center's wonderful analysis. Please join us again next time, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts and comments on this program as we think about conflicts to watch and really what can be done about them in 2025. So thank you for joining us today.